The black waiter corrected a CEO's racist joke. What happened next shocked the entire restaurant. The restaurant glowed under the soft light of chandeliers, where laughter, polished cutlery, and clinking wineglasses created a false harmony. It was the kind of place where power sat at every table, where deals worth millions were whispered over desserts, and where appearances mattered more than truth. At the center of this elegant chaos worked Malik, a young black waiter with an unshakable calmness and quiet pride. He carried trays with precision, every movement graceful, every word respectful. Malik had seen it all. Businessmen boasting about fortunes, celebrities flashing charm, and politicians pretending they were ordinary. Yet, no matter how many high-profile guests walked through the doors, Malik never let their arrogance unsettle him. He had his dignity, though life had not been kind enough to always let him show it. This evening was different. The restaurant had been booked out for a corporate dinner by one of the most powerful companies in the city. Their CEO, Richard Hale, was a man whose name commanded boardrooms and silenced competitors. People feared him, envied him, and some worshipped him. And tonight, he sat at the grandest table with his executives, their laughter growing louder with every drink poured. But beneath the surface of luxury, an ugliness was about to rise. As Malik approached the table with another round of drinks, the CEO leaned back, a smug grin forming. He launched into a joke. It was meant to entertain, to make his table roar with laughter. But the words that left his mouth were venom. Sharp, degrading, and targeted at people who looked exactly like Malik. The entire table erupted in laughter. Glasses slammed against the table, chairs rocked with amusement. And in the middle of it all, Malik froze. The joke was not just offensive, it was cruel. It was the kind of joke meant to strip away dignity, to remind someone of where society thought they belonged. For a moment, Malik felt the weight of generations pressing down on him. His mother's warnings about keeping his head down, his father's lessons about pride, the stories of ancestors who endured worse so he could stand where he stood. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. He had two choices: stay silent, let the laughter die, and continue to serve as though nothing had happened, or speak, risk everything, correct the man who believed himself untouchable. And then, in a voice steady but strong, Malik made his choice. The laughter stopped. Forks froze halfway to mouths, and the restaurant air turned heavy, as though every person could feel history itself leaning in to witness what would happen next. The waiter had corrected the CEO. The question was, what would it cost him? The words Malik had spoken lingered in the air, heavier than the chandeliers above, heavier than the luxury that surrounded the table. It was as if the restaurant itself paused to inhale, waiting to see what would follow. The CEO, Richard Hale, blinked slowly. His grin, so smug moments ago, faltered into disbelief. His executives, caught mid-laughter, now stared with wide eyes, their smiles frozen into twisted masks of guilt and fear. Even diners at nearby tables, who hadn't heard the joke clearly, but sensed the sudden shift in mood, turned their heads. It was a silence that carried judgment, the kind that exposes the truth no one dares say out loud. Malik stood there, tray in hand, his back straight. His chest rose and fell, but his face was calm, not smug, not apologetic, simply resolute. He had spoken because he had to, not for applause, not to shame, but because dignity demanded it. The CEO finally leaned forward, his eyes narrowing like a predator. "Excuse me?" His voice was low, sharp, meant to cut. But Malik did not flinch. Inside, Malik's heart thundered, threatening to betray his calm exterior. He knew the danger. A man like Hale could end his job, destroy his reputation, and maybe even blackball him from every restaurant in the city. Yet Malik also knew something else. Silence was complicity. If he said nothing, he was just another bystander in a world that thrived on keeping people like him quiet. Hale's executives shifted uncomfortably. One of them looked down at his plate, pretending to cut his steak into smaller pieces, though his hands shook. Another nervously sipped his wine, spilling a drop on his tie. They had all laughed at the joke seconds ago, eager to please their powerful boss. But now, the weight of Malik's correction pressed against their chests like a shame they couldn't escape. The CEO's laugh returned, but this time it was hollow, forced. "You've got some nerve," he muttered, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Correcting me, a waiter, in my city, in front of my people." A few guests at neighboring tables gasped softly. The arrogance in his words confirmed what Malik's correction had already exposed. This wasn't about a joke anymore. It was about power. Malik bowed his head slightly, his tone respectful but unyielding. He had no intention of escalating, but he also had no intention of retreating. That balance, standing tall without shouting, was what made his presence even more unnerving. The CEO's face reddened. He looked around the table, expecting his executives to back him, to laugh, to pile on against Malik, but none of them dared. They could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant burning into them. To side with Hale now would mean exposing themselves as cowards complicit in cruelty. For the first time in a long time, Richard Hale found himself alone, and that, more than Malik's correction, rattled him. The restaurant manager, a short, balding man who lived in constant fear of upsetting wealthy clients, rushed to the table. His face was pale, his voice trembling as he stammered apologies. "Mr. Hale, sir, I assure you this will be addressed immediately. Malik, step into the back right now." But before Malik could move, something happened that no one expected. From the far side of the restaurant, an elderly man slowly rose from his table. His cane clicked against the polished floor as he walked, each step deliberate. His white hair gleamed under the soft lights, his suit sharp but not flashy. There was something in his presence that drew every eye, as though respect followed him naturally. He stopped right beside Malik, looked at Richard Hale and spoke in a calm, steady tone that carried more weight than any outburst ever could. The entire restaurant leaned in, because this was no ordinary diner. This was a man who knew power as well as Hale did. But unlike Hale, he knew how to wield it without cruelty. And what he said next would change the entire course of the night. The cane tapped once against the marble floor, sharp enough to command silence. Conversations that had started up again died instantly. The clink of cutlery ceased. Even the soft jazz playing in the background seemed to hush, as though the very walls leaned forward to listen. The elderly man placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, steady, reassuring, as if silently telling him, "You are not alone in this." Malik felt the strength in that touch. Not physical, but moral. The kind of strength that only comes from someone who has fought battles, endured storms, and emerged with their dignity intact. Richard Hale leaned back in his chair, his smugness flickering like a candle in the wind. For once, he did not control the room. "And who exactly are you?" he sneered, attempting to reclaim dominance. His voice cracked slightly, betraying irritation. The elderly man ignored the insult. His gaze did not waver. His eyes, a piercing steel grey, locked on Hale with a weight that made even the CEO squirm. He spoke slowly, every word deliberate. "This young man showed more courage in 5 seconds than most men do in a lifetime. And you, Richard Hale, have shown the opposite. You've revealed what kind of leader you are, and what kind of empire you run." The words struck like hammer blows. Executives who had been staring at their plates now froze, their eyes darting between their boss and the stranger. Malik's heart raced. He wanted to understand who this man was. His voice carried more authority than any wealthy diner Malik had ever served. It was not arrogance. It was command, built from decades of respect. Hale forced a laugh, louder this time, masking his unease. "Do you know who I am? Do you even realize the weight I carry in this city?" The old man finally smiled, a small, knowing smile that made Hale's confidence unravel further. "Yes," he replied softly. "I know exactly who you are. And that's the problem." The restaurant erupted in a hush of whispers. Diners leaned across tables, phones subtly lifted to record. Sensing history in the making, Malik gripped his tray tighter, standing in stunned silence. He felt the atmosphere shift again, like storm clouds gathering before thunder. Then came the reveal. The elderly man straightened his back, his hand never leaving the cane. "My name," he said, "is Judge Henry Whitaker, retired, but I've spent 40 years presiding over courtrooms, watching men like you try to twist words, buy loyalty, and silence truth. And you know what I learned in all those years. The louder a man insists on his power, the more fragile it truly is." The effect was electric. Gasps rippled through the room. A judge, not just a wealthy guest, not a random old man, a man who had weighed evidence, spoken verdicts, and decided fates. A man whose very profession was truth. Richard Hale's face drained of color. His bluster faltered. For the first time, he looked small. Judge Whitaker turned slightly, his voice carrying now to everyone listening. "We live in a time where people think money buys respect, but respect, real respect, is earned. And tonight, this waiter has shown more leadership, more moral clarity than the man you all call your CEO." The executives fidgeted, shame spreading across their faces. Every diner present could feel the shift. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a reckoning. Malik's throat tightened. He had never expected support, let alone from a man of such stature. All he had wanted was to keep his dignity, but now his simple act of courage had drawn out an ally he never imagined. As someone who could match Richard Hale's power and strip it bare in front of everyone, the CEO tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him, trembling slightly. His hands gripped the edge of the table. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his voice less commanding than desperate. "He's just a waiter. You don't even know what he said to me." But the judge cut him off with a raised hand. "Well, we all know what was said, and if anyone here doubts it, let them reflect on why their laughter died the moment truth was spoken." The silence that followed was deafening. The guilt was inescapable. And then, like a slow wave building strength, something remarkable happened. Diners, ordinary strangers, witnesses to the moment, began nodding, murmuring words of agreement. Some even tapped the table in quiet support. It was small at first, but it spread, rising in momentum until the restaurant's atmosphere transformed entirely. Malik realized with a shock that the tide had turned. Not only had Richard Hale lost the room, Malik had won it. But Judge Whittaker wasn't finished. His eyes narrowed, his voice steady as iron. "You owe this man an apology. Not tomorrow, not when it's convenient. Now, because if you don't, you will find that the reputation you've built in this city can vanish faster than a dropped glass shattering on the floor." Every pair of eyes landed on Hale. The CEO who had once commanded, fear now sat cornered, his empire crumbling not in boardrooms or markets, but in the judgment of a single night. Malik held his breath. The entire restaurant did the same. And in that moment, the unthinkable teetered on the edge of happening. A man of immense power being humbled before a waiter he tried to humiliate. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, as though the walls of the restaurant themselves were waiting to hear what Richard Hale would do. Dozens of eyes were locked on him. For years, he had thrived in rooms like this, places where his wealth, charm and reputation bent people to his will. But tonight he sat in the center of the storm, cornered by truth he could not buy his way out of. His fingers drummed nervously against the mahogany table. His usual grin had vanished. Instead, there was only a twitch at the corner of his mouth. Betraying panic, he tried to mask his irritation. Judge Whittaker's steady gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering, the kind of stare that had silenced countless liars, manipulators, and arrogant men in courtrooms for decades. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the weight of history pressing down on Hale's shoulders. Malik could feel his own heart hammering in his chest. He had not planned for any of this. All he had done was correct a cruel joke. But now, the scales of justice, once tilted against him, seemed to swing wildly in his favor. Hale finally stood, his chair screeching against the marble floor. His sudden movement startled nearby diners. His voice cracked as he barked, "This is absurd! Do you all really think you can judge me? Do you know how many jobs I provide in this city? Do you know the charities my name supports? You sit here feasting in a restaurant I practically built, and you dare to question me?" His words echoed loudly, but instead of inspiring respect, they bounced hollowly, exposing his desperation. Every syllable revealed a man clinging to power like a drowning. Man clings to driftwood. One of his executives, seated to his right, shifted uncomfortably. For years these men had laughed at his jokes, nodded at his orders and obeyed his whims. But tonight, they remained silent, their faces pale, their loyalties shaken. Judge Whittaker finally spoke, calm and deliberate. "This isn't about jobs or donations. This isn't about power. This is about dignity. And you chose to strip a man of his, not because he wronged you, but because you thought you could." The old man's voice was low, but it carried more weight than Hale's shouting. Murmurs rippled through the room. Diners whispered, some even lifting phones again, capturing every second. In this digital age, reputation could be destroyed not in weeks, but in minutes. Hale seemed to realize it too, his eyes darting toward the glow of recording screens. He slammed his fist on the table. "Turn those off! Do you hear me? Off!" His demand fell flat. Not a single phone lowered. Instead, more hands rose, capturing him at his weakest, a titan unraveling. Malik's chest tightened as he watched. He had spent years being invisible, overlooked, dismissed. But tonight that invisibility shattered. He was no longer the quiet waiter in the background. Every eye that once ignored him now saw him clearly, standing taller than the man who had tried to reduce him. Hale's breathing grew heavier. His empire of control, fear, money, prestige, was slipping through his fingers. He turned back to Judge Whittaker, his voice dropping, quieter now, almost pleading. "You don't understand. This isn't how things are supposed to go." But the judge only shook his head. "No, Richard. This is exactly how things are supposed to go when arrogance meets truth. The words landed like a gavel strike, final, irrefutable. Then, something extraordinary happened. A woman from across the room, an older diner who had sat silently through the confrontation, began tapping her fork against her glass. The sound was small at first, but it carried a single note of defiance against the CEO. Then another diner joined in, then another. The soft rhythmic sound grew louder, echoing like a drumbeat. It wasn't applause, not yet. It was something older, more primal, the sound of judgment, of collective agreement that Richard Hale's reign of intimidation was over. Hale's face flushed crimson, his hands trembled. He wanted to lash out again, but every instinct told him it would only dig his grave deeper. And then came the final blow. Judge Whittaker leaned on his cane, his voice low but clear enough for all to hear. You asked if anyone knew who you were. But after tonight, Richard, you'll wish they didn't, because the world will remember not your wealth, but this moment. The night a black waiter showed more honor than you ever possessed. The fork tapping erupted into full applause. Tables clapped, diners cheered, some even rose to their feet. The sound engulfed the room, drowning Hale in humiliation. Malik stood frozen, overwhelmed. He felt a wave of emotion surge through him. Disbelief, relief, vindication. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He was standing in victory, not because of wealth or status, but because truth had found a voice. Hale slumped back into his chair, defeated. His empire of pride crumbled not in boardrooms, not in headlines, but in the eyes of strangers who saw his true face. And Malik? For the first time, he was more than just the waiter. He was a man whose courage had shifted the balance of an entire room. And perhaps even more, the restaurant's applause slowly ebbed, but the echo of clapping lingered, like a storm that had rolled through and forever changed the landscape. When the last fork stilled, a hush remained, not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of clarity. Everyone knew something irreversible had just happened. Richard Hale sat slumped in his chair, staring at the white tablecloth as though it might swallow him whole. His shoulders, once squared with arrogance, now sagged under the crushing weight of exposure. For decades he had played puppeteer, pulling strings behind boardrooms, charities and neighborhoods. Tonight, the strings had snapped, leaving him a man without control. Malik remained frozen at the edge of the table, every muscle taut with disbelief. He had not entered this evening to make a statement or spark a reckoning. He had been scheduled to serve entrees, refill glasses, and vanish into the background as he always did. Yet somehow he had stepped into history. Judge Whittaker tapped his cane once, the sound sharp and final. This evening is over, he said softly, not as a command, but as an unspoken verdict. Diners nodded, gathering belongings, yet no one left in haste. They lingered, casting furtive glances at Malik, their faces etched with newfound respect. Some whispered his name to one another. Others shook their heads in awe, murmuring about his courage, about the way he had stood firm when so many would have bowed. Malik felt their eyes, and for once, he did not shrink away. But the night's ripple effect was only just beginning. By the next morning, the restaurant's confrontation had spread across the city like wildfire. Those discreet phone recordings had found their way to social media. Millions of views piled up overnight. The comment sections flooded with outrage, admiration and disbelief. Hashtags trended. News anchors replayed the grainy footage, dissecting every word of Judge Whittaker, every expression of Richard Hale, every moment Malik stood his ground. The narrative was clear. A CEO had cracked a racist joke, expecting laughter. Instead, a waiter had corrected him, and in doing so, exposed the arrogance of an empire. Suddenly, Malik's face was everywhere. Not as the help, not as someone invisible, but as a symbol of dignity in the face of humiliation. For Richard Hale, the collapse was brutal and swift. Investors distanced themselves, citing concerns about reputational damage. Charities returned his donations, unwilling to be tied to his name. Several board members resigned, publicly condemning his behavior. The empire he had spent decades building didn't crumble in silence. It was torn apart in the full view of the same public he once believed he owned. The final blow came when a long-forgotten lawsuit resurfaced. Claims of discrimination against his company, buried years ago under legal muscle. Now, in the light of the viral scandal, the case was reopened. What was once dismissed as allegations suddenly carried the weight of truth. Hale tried to fight back, to spin the narrative, but no one listened. His voice, once amplified through power, now echoed hollow in empty halls. For Malik, life shifted overnight. He arrived at the restaurant the next evening expecting awkward stares, maybe even reprimands from management. Instead, the owner pulled him aside. The man's expression was heavy, complicated. "You don't belong behind a tray anymore," he said simply. "You belong where your voice can be heard." At first, Malik didn't understand. He had bills to pay, a family to support. Serving tables wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Yet offers soon began to pour in. Community organizations wanted him to speak. Universities invited him to share his story with students. Even law firms reached out, impressed by the way he had held his ground with the composure of a trained advocate. He found himself standing in rooms he never imagined, not as a servant, but as a guest of honor. And in each room, he carried the same quiet dignity that had changed the course of that fateful night. Weeks later, Malik received a letter. The handwriting was elegant, firm. It was from Judge Whitaker. Inside was a short note. "Young man, I once stood in a courtroom where no one listened to my words. Because of the color of my skin, I swore that if I ever lived long enough to see." Another voice, silenced for the same reason, "I would make certain the world heard it. That night in the restaurant was not about me. It was about you. Do not waste the gift you have been given. The world needs more men like you." Alongside the note was a check, a sum large enough to erase Malik's debts, to pay for his siblings' education, to secure a home for his mother. But more valuable than the money was the quiet endorsement. A judge, a man who had carried the weight of justice his entire life, had seen Malik not as a waiter, but as an equal in the fight for dignity. Richard Hale faded from headlines within months, a cautionary tale of arrogance undone by truth. His fortune dwindled. His name became synonymous with disgrace. Malik, however, became something more than he ever imagined. He continued working part-time at the restaurant, not because he had to, but because he wanted to stay grounded. Diners came not to be served, but to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him that his courage gave them strength in their own lives. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer a shadow moving silently between tables. He was a symbol, proof that even in a world stacked against him, a single act of truth could ripple outward, dismantling arrogance, lifting dignity, and reminding everyone that courage, no matter how small it seems, can echo louder than power. Picture Malik walking out of the restaurant late one night, apron slung over his shoulder, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. He pauses, hearing the echo of applause that once shook the room. For the first time, he smiles not with hesitation, but with certainty. He understands now. He was never just a waiter. He was a man whose truth had reshaped the balance of an entire room, and the world had listened.